In a quiet village, far away from the noise and distractions of modern cities, there lived a man who was known for his wealth but rarely seen by others. He was a landowner who possessed vast fields, tall trees, and a large mansion hidden behind old stone walls. Despite his riches, he lived a life of mystery and silence. Villagers often whispered about him, wondering why someone with so much money chose to remain alone and distant. Some said he was protecting secrets, others believed he simply preferred his own company. One morning, this man surprised everyone by posting an unusual notice in the village square. The paper was nailed to the wooden board where villagers normally read about harvest fairs, lost animals, or small trade offers. But this notice was different. Written in bold letters, it called for a dedicated worker. The most shocking part, however, was not the request itself, but the reward he promised. Unlike ordinary jobs where payment was small and barely enough to survive, this notice offered high wages, far more than anyone in the village had ever been paid for simple labor. For the villagers, this was both exciting and suspicious. Why would a man of such fortune, who never asked for help before, suddenly need a worker? And why was he willing to pay so much? Some villagers believed it was an opportunity from heaven, a chance to change their lives forever. Others worried that something strange or dangerous might be hidden behind the offer. People gathered around the notice, reading the words again and again, trying to guess the true meaning. Was the landowner searching for someone loyal, someone he could trust with his secrets? Was the work going to be normal farm duties, or something unusual that no one had ever imagined? The air in the village filled with questions and curiosity. For many families who struggled to put food on the table, the temptation was powerful. The job could pay for better houses, clothes, and education for their children. Yet fear held them back. The landowner's mysterious nature made everyone cautious. Accepting such an offer might lead to fortune or to disaster. In the evenings, villagers gathered around fires, discussing who might be brave enough to step forward. Some thought only a desperate man would take the risk. Others believed only a clever and dedicated soul would succeed. The notice did not give details about the work, only the promise of wealth for whoever proved themselves worthy. Slowly, whispers turned into debates, and debates turned into plans. The village that was once calm now buzzed with restless energy. Everyone knew that this unusual job notice was about to change someone's destiny. Whether for better or worse, the opportunity placed by the reclusive landowner became the most talked about subject in the village, and all eyes turned toward the mansion on the hill, waiting to see who would be the first to knock on his heavy wooden door. In the village, people often spoke in low voices about the mysterious landowner and his strange habits. Around the marketplace, near the wells, and even outside the small houses, whispers passed from one person to another. The story was always the same. Many men and women had once accepted the landowner's offer of work, tempted by the promise of wealth and the hope of a better life. They walked up the long path to his mansion, knocked on the heavy wooden door, and disappeared behind its tall gates. At first, the villagers thought these workers might have found success, perhaps too busy enjoying their new fortune to return. But as the weeks turned into months, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. Not a single person who went to work for the landowner was ever seen in the village again. They did not come back to visit their families, they did not write letters, and they left no signs of where they had gone. Some villagers claimed that these workers had run away to start new lives far from the village, taking their wages with them. Others were not so sure. They said that if the landowner was truly paying such high wages, then why wouldn't even one worker return to show proof of their success? Instead, the silence was complete, as though the landowner's mansion had swallowed them whole. Mothers clutched their children tighter whenever they passed near his lands, and fathers warned their sons never to accept his offer. Even the bravest men, who had once laughed at the idea of fear, now lowered their voices whenever the subject came up. The more time passed, the more the mystery grew. Some villagers told stories of strange lights shining from the mansion windows at night. Others swore they had heard cries carried on the wind, quickly silenced before anyone could be sure. A few people believed that the landowner practiced dark and secret arts, using the workers for purposes no one dared to name aloud. Yet there were always those who argued differently. They said the landowner was simply a man of power, one who demanded loyalty and silence. Perhaps the workers had been given riches, but in exchange they had promised never to return or reveal the truth. Whatever the case, the fact remained, none of the workers ever came back. And so the landowner's notice, offering wealth for dedicated service, carried both hope and dread. For the poor and desperate, it still glittered like a chance at freedom. But for the cautious and fearful, it was a trap that led to vanishing. Every time someone stood before that notice, they remembered the whispers, "Many have gone before, but none ever stayed long, nor were they seen again." The words echoed through the village like a warning, leaving everyone torn between curiosity and terror, between the dream of wealth and the risk of disappearing forever. For the poor villagers, life was a constant struggle. Each day began with the worry of whether there would be enough food to eat or enough money to buy even the smallest necessities. Families lived in small, broken houses, patched together with wood and mud, barely strong enough to keep out the wind and rain. The children wore clothes that were torn and faded, handed down from one sibling to another, and their shoes were often worn thin from years of use. Work in the fields was exhausting and paid very little, often just enough to survive from one day to the next. Many fathers and mothers went to bed hungry so that their children could have a little more to eat. Hope was scarce, and dreams of a better life felt far away. That is why, when the notice appeared from the wealthy but mysterious landowner, the villagers could not help but be tempted. The words were simple yet powerful. The job promised food, shelter, and double wages. For people who could barely afford bread, this sounded almost like a miracle. The promise of food meant no more empty stomachs or nights spent worrying about the next meal. The offer of shelter suggested safety, protection from storms, and a chance to live in a place far better than the crumbling huts they had always known. And double wages, something beyond imagination, meant that they could finally escape poverty, buy warm clothes for winter, and perhaps even save enough to give their children a brighter future. The more they thought about it, the more impossible it became to resist. Around cooking fires and in small gatherings, villagers whispered about the opportunity. Some said that anyone who refused such an offer was a fool. Others argued that it was dangerous, pointing to the stories of workers who had never returned. But hunger is a powerful force, and desperation can silence even the loudest warnings. A starving man will always reach for bread, even if it comes from an unknown hand. To the struggling poor, the landowner's promise felt like a doorway to a new life. The thought of food on the table every day and money enough to live with dignity outweighed the fears that haunted the village. Mothers dreamed of their children sleeping under solid roofs, and fathers imagined working without the constant worry of debt. It was too good to ignore, too strong a temptation to resist. And so, despite the warnings, many found themselves drawn to the mansion on the hill, ready to accept the mysterious offer. They told themselves that perhaps the stories were wrong, that maybe the landowner was simply generous, and that fortune had finally come their way. But deep inside, fear lingered, whispering that promises so perfect often carried hidden dangers. Still, in a life of suffering, even a dangerous hope was better than none at all. Among the villagers who read the mysterious notice, one stood out, a young man named Rafik. He had only recently arrived in the area, carrying little more than a small bag and the weight of his troubled past. No one knew exactly where he came from, but it was clear from his appearance that life had not been kind to him. His clothes were worn and dusty, his shoes nearly falling apart, and his eyes carried the heavy look of someone who had fought too many silent battles. Rafik was desperate, searching for a way to survive in a world that seemed determined to push him down. Unlike the others who debated the risks and whispered warnings late into the night, Rafik felt he had no choice. He had no family to protect him, no land to farm, and no steady work to keep him alive. Each day was a struggle just to find a little food and a safe corner to rest. When he saw the notice, promising food, shelter, and double wages, his heart leapt with a mix of relief and urgency. To him, the offer was not suspicious, it was salvation. While other villagers hesitated, weighing fear against hope, Rafik's decision was immediate. He did not ask for advice, nor did he spend time thinking of the dangers that others feared. Hunger had sharpened his mind to one simple truth: an opportunity like this was too rare to ignore. And so, without hesitation, he made up his mind. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Rafik packed what little he owned and began walking toward the mansion on the hill. His steps were steady, his resolve unshaken. Villagers watched him from a distance, some shaking their heads in pity, others whispering that he was either very brave or very foolish. Mothers pulled their children closer as he passed, warning them quietly never to follow in his footsteps. Yet, there was also a sense of admiration in the air, for Rafik had done what many were too afraid to do. He had embraced the chance, no matter the cost. As he approached the large gates of the mansion, his heart beat faster. The walls towered above him, casting long shadows across the path. The heavy wooden door loomed like the entrance to another world, one that could hold either fortune or doom. Still, Rafik did not falter. He lifted his hand and knocked firmly, ready to face whatever waited inside. To him, the fear that paralyzed the villagers did not matter. What mattered was survival, and the hope that this choice, reckless as it seemed, might finally give him the life he had always dreamed of. With that single act of courage, or perhaps desperation, Rafik stepped into the unknown, unaware that his decision would soon become the talk of the entire village, and that his fate would be tied forever to the mysteries of the reclusive landowner. Rafik's footsteps slowed as he finally reached the landowner's mansion, a place that looked nothing like the simple homes he had passed in the village. The building rose high above the ground, its dark stone walls towering over the path like a silent giant. Even in the daylight, the mansion carried an eerie presence, as though shadows clung to it no matter how brightly the sun shone. The windows, tall and narrow, reflected the light in such a way that they looked more like watchful eyes than glass. Around the mansion stretched walls so high and thick that they gave the impression of a fortress rather than a home. To a stranger, those walls might seem designed to keep thieves and trespassers away, but to the villagers, they told another story. The walls were too tall, too heavy, too carefully built. They seemed designed not only to keep people out, but to keep something, or someone, locked inside. Whispers about these walls had long traveled through the village. Children were told never to play near them, and adults often lowered their voices when speaking about what might lie hidden behind their cold stone surface. Some believed the mansion itself held secrets darker than night, and that the walls served as a cage for mysteries the landowner did not want revealed. Standing before them, Rafik felt a chill crawl across his skin. He wondered if the air truly was colder here, or if fear was making him shiver. The iron gate stood closed, its bars twisted into strange shapes that almost looked like claws. Vines climbed the stone walls, clinging tightly as if even nature itself was trying to keep whatever was inside from escaping. Rafik had seen rich houses before in his travels, but none had ever carried such a strange, uneasy weight. Most grand homes welcomed visitors with open gardens and carved pathways, yet this mansion looked more like a prison dressed as a palace. The silence around it only deepened the strangeness. No birds sang from the trees nearby, no dogs barked, and not even the wind seemed willing to whistle through its cracks. It was as though the mansion existed in its own world, separate from the village, surrounded by walls that kept more than just strangers away. Rafik tightened his grip on the small bag he carried, his mind racing. He had chosen to accept the job, but now, standing before this mansion, he felt the weight of that decision press against him. Still, he reminded himself of the promise: food, shelter, and double wages. For a man who had nothing, even a place as eerie as this seemed worth the risk. With steady breath, he stepped closer to the gate, staring up at the massive walls one last time. They seemed to stare back at him, warning him that once he entered, he might never leave the same. Yet, driven by desperation, Rafik raised his hand and prepared to knock. When the heavy wooden door of the mansion finally opened, Rafik was greeted by the landowner himself. To Rafik's surprise, the man did not appear cruel or harsh at first glance. He was dressed in fine clothes, his voice calm, and his manner polite. With a smile that seemed almost too perfect, the landowner extended his hand and spoke words of welcome, as if Rafik were a long-expected guest rather than a stranger seeking work. For a brief moment, the young man felt his fear slip away. After all, the villagers had described the landowner as distant and reclusive, but here he was, showing kindness to someone who had nothing to offer but his labor. Yet, even as Rafik tried to believe in the man's warmth, something about him unsettled the air. It was his eyes. They were sharp, pale, and unblinking, as if they could see through every layer of Rafik's thoughts. Unlike his smile, which seemed rehearsed and shallow, the eyes revealed no comfort. Instead, they carried a coldness that felt unnatural, a chill that pierced through the skin and sank into the heart. Rafik found it difficult to hold the man's gaze for more than a few seconds. It was as though the landowner's eyes were not welcoming him, but measuring him, studying him like one might examine a tool, deciding whether it was useful or disposable. The longer Rafik stood there, the clearer it became. The warmth in the landowner's voice was only a mask, carefully worn to hide something darker. His eyes betrayed him, exposing a truth that his smile tried to cover. They spoke of secrets too heavy to name, of intentions hidden beneath layers of politeness. Rafik felt a strange shiver run down his spine, though the landowner's tone remained gentle. He could not explain it, but in those eyes he saw warning. Still, desperation has a way of silencing doubt. Rafik reminded himself of why he had come: the promise of food, shelter, and double wages. The landowner's eerie presence could not outweigh the hunger in his stomach and the emptiness of his pockets. Forcing himself to push aside the unease, he nodded respectfully and stepped inside the grand hall. The mansion smelled of polished wood and old stone, and the air was heavy, as though the walls themselves had absorbed years of silence. Behind him, the door closed with a sound that echoed through the hall like the final note of a warning bell. Rafik tried not to think about it. He told himself that this was his chance at a better life. But deep down, the image of those cold, piercing eyes stayed with him, whispering a truth he could not ignore, that behind the landowner's smile, there was something dangerous, something waiting to reveal itself. And though he would not admit it aloud, Rafik already knew he had stepped into a world where appearances could not be trusted. Once Rafik stepped inside the mansion, the landowner wasted no time in setting the conditions of his stay. The young man had expected to hear about ordinary duties: cleaning the halls, tending to the grounds, or carrying out farm work. Instead, what he heard was unsettling and unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The landowner's voice was calm and steady, yet the rules he spoke sounded more like warnings than instructions. "There are rules here," he said firmly, "and they must never be broken." The first rule was simple, yet strangely specific: No questions after dark. During the day, Rafik was free to speak, ask, and learn about his tasks. But once the sun set and shadows filled the halls, silence was demanded. No matter what he saw or heard at night, he was not to ask about it. The second rule was even stranger. Certain doors in the mansion were forbidden. They were to remain locked and untouched, as if they concealed things not meant for ordinary eyes. The landowner made it clear that opening those doors, even by mistake, would lead to consequences too severe to imagine. Rafik felt his chest tighten as he wondered what could possibly be hidden behind them. The final rule was perhaps the most suffocating of all. He was never to leave the mansion without permission. The gates, the walls, and the locked doors suddenly made sense. They were not simply to keep outsiders away, but to keep those inside from escaping freely. Rafik nodded as each rule was spoken, though deep inside he felt a storm of unease. His instincts told him that these were not the rules of a workplace, but of a prison disguised as a home. Yet the landowner's sharp eyes left no room for protest. Each rule was delivered with such authority that Rafik dared not question them. He reminded himself of the promise, food, shelter, and double wages, and tried to quiet the fears rising in his chest. Still, the more he thought about the rules, the more disturbing they seemed. Why silence after dark? Why forbidden doors in a place that was supposed to be a simple household? Why prevent a worker from leaving freely? None of it made sense, yet Rafik forced a smile and agreed, knowing that his survival depended on obedience. The landowner's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but his cold eyes glimmered with a warning that Rafik could not ignore. At that moment, the young man realized he had entered not just a mansion, but a world ruled by secrets, silence, and control. Every step he took from then on would have to be careful, every word measured, and every thought hidden. For in this mansion, breaking a rule was not a mistake, it was a sentence. One evening, as Rafik carried out his duties within the vast mansion, he paused to catch his breath in the long, silent hallway. It was then that he noticed a faint sound drifting through the air, so soft at first that he thought he had imagined it. But when he stood still and listened more carefully, the noise became clearer. It was not the sound of wind through the cracks, nor the creaking of old wooden beams. It was something far more unsettling, muffled cries, faint and broken, as though someone was calling for help from far beneath the ground. The sound seemed to rise from the depths of the estate, echoing through the stone floors and walls like whispers trapped in a dungeon. Rafik's heart began to race. He held his breath, straining his ears, trying to catch every note of the mysterious cries. They were not loud, but they were sharp enough to chill his bones. Fear prickled his skin as he realized that these were not animal noises. They carried the pain, fear, and desperation of human voices. His first instinct was to follow the sound, to see where it led, but almost immediately he remembered the landowner's strict rules. No questions after dark and never open forbidden doors. Still, his curiosity gnawed at him, stronger with every passing second. Gathering his courage, he approached the landowner, who was seated in his grand study, sipping a glass of wine under the dim glow of a chandelier. "Sir," Rafik began hesitantly, "I think I heard something." Cries, coming from beneath the estate. The landowner did not flinch. His smile remained calm, and his voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. He waved a dismissive hand and said, "Ah, that must be the dogs in the cellar. They get restless at night." His words were casual, as if the matter was of no importance. But something about his answer struck Rafik as wrong. The sound he had heard was not barking, not growling, not the restless whine of animals. It had been the sound of suffering. Yet the landowner's sharp eyes, cold and unblinking, told him to accept the explanation without question. Rafik lowered his gaze, nodded, and forced himself to remain silent. though his mind screamed with doubt. As he walked away, the cries still echoed faintly in his memory, refusing to be forgotten. He told himself that perhaps the landowner was right, perhaps fear had tricked his senses, but deep down he knew better. Those were not dogs. That night, as he lay on the narrow bed given to him, Rafik could still hear the muffled cries in his head, haunting him like a secret only he had uncovered. He realized then that the mansion was not just a place of wealth and rules, it was a place of hidden voices, buried beneath the earth, voices that the landowner desperately wanted silenced. And Rafik, whether he liked it or not, had begun to hear them. One afternoon, while carrying out his daily chores, Rafik was dusting shelves in one of the mansion's seldom-used rooms. The space was dim, filled with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. Books lined the walls, some covered in thick layers of dust, as if no one had touched them for years. As he moved a heavy stack of ledgers to clean beneath them, one book slipped from the pile and fell to the floor. The sound echoed loudly in the silence of the room, startling him. When he bent to pick it up, he realized this book was different. Its cover was plain and worn, without any title or decoration, as though it was never meant to be noticed. Curiosity tugged at him, and though he remembered the rules about forbidden things, he could not resist. He carefully opened the ledger, and what he saw inside made his heart freeze. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, each line carrying a name. They were not names of strangers, but names that Rafik recognized, people from the village. Men who had once worked here, women who had once accepted the mysterious offer, neighbors whose disappearances were still whispered about late at night. Every page seemed to hold another name from the past, stretching back years, maybe even decades. At first, he thought it might be a record of employment, but his blood ran cold when he noticed the word written next to each one. In bold, careful letters, every single entry was marked the same, completed. Rafik stared at the pages, his hands trembling as he turned them one after another. Dozens of names, all marked with that same chilling word. Completed. The meaning was clear enough, and yet his mind struggled to accept it. These were not workers who had left with wealth or comfort. These were people who had vanished, and now he knew why. They had not left by choice. They had been completed, whatever that meant. A cold sweat broke across his skin, and for the first time since entering the mansion, he truly understood the danger surrounding him. Just then, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor outside, pulling him back to reality. Panicked, he quickly closed the ledger and slid it back where he had found it, making sure it looked untouched. His heart pounded as the door creaked open, though it was only a servant passing by. Still, Rafik knew he had come dangerously close to being discovered. That night, lying awake in his small bed, he could not shake the memory of the ledger from his mind. The names haunted him, each one representing a life cut short or swallowed by the mansion's secrets. And now, he feared, his own name might one day be written there too, with the same final word beside it, completed. The storm raged outside, with heavy rain striking the windows like 1,000 tiny fists and thunder rolling across the sky in deep, angry growls. Lightning flashed through the cracks of the curtains, throwing sharp shadows along the walls of the mansion. It was on this night, when the air felt heavier than usual and silence carried strange weight, that Rafik found himself wandering the dim corridors, his mind restless and filled with unease. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every corner darker, as though the mansion itself was alive and watching his every move. His steps, though hesitant, carried him toward a part of the estate he had never dared to explore, the basement. For days, his thoughts had been troubled by the muffled cries he once heard, the strange rules he was forced to follow, and the hidden ledger filled with names marked completed. All of it pulled at his curiosity like invisible strings, leading him deeper into the mystery. And now, with the storm shaking the walls and his fear mixed with reckless courage, he followed where his instincts pushed him. At the end of a narrow hallway, he reached a heavy wooden door, darker and more worn than the others in the mansion. It stood locked with an iron clasp, but what froze Rafik in place was not the lock, it was the trail. Faint but unmistakable, thin stains of dried blood streaked the stone floor, leading directly to the basement door. The sight struck him harder than the thunder outside. His chest tightened as questions screamed inside his mind. Whose blood was it? How long had it been there? And why had no one cleaned it away? He crouched down, running his trembling fingers near the marks but not daring to touch them. The stains seemed old, yet fresh enough to remind him that they had once belonged to someone living. The air near the door carried a different smell too, thick and metallic, mixed with the dampness of stone. Rafik's heart pounded violently in his chest. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the landowner's cold eyes watching him from the shadows. But the hallway was empty, filled only with the echo of dripping rain outside. Still, he knew he had little time. If he was caught here, near this forbidden door, there would be no excuse that could save him. His mind battled between fear and the gnawing urge to know the truth. That door, locked and silent, seemed to hold the answers to every strange event in the mansion. The missing workers, the cries at night, the ledger of names. A loud crack of thunder shook the building, and for a moment, Rafik thought he heard something else from behind the basement door. A faint sound, low and weak, almost like breathing, or was it sobbing? His blood ran cold. He stepped closer, pressing his ear against the wood, listening to the secrets hidden beneath the estate. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his curiosity chained him to that spot. Little did Rafik know, this single moment before the locked basement door would change everything, dragging him deeper into the mansion's darkest truth. With trembling hands, Rafik finally managed to force the basement door open. The hinges groaned as if they had not been moved in years, and a cold draft rushed out, carrying with it a smell so strong and foul that he staggered back. It was not just the scent of damp stone and forgotten air, it was something far worse, something metallic and rotten, a stench that seemed to sink into his very bones. Steeling himself, he stepped inside, holding a lantern high to pierce the suffocating darkness. What the light revealed made his heart pound and his breath catch in his throat. Along the damp walls hung rusted shackles, still fixed in place, their chains clinking faintly as if moved by an invisible hand. The iron cuffs were stained and worn, as though many wrists had been forced inside them over the years. On the floor, scattered across the dirt and stone, lay torn pieces of clothing. They were not scraps of fabric forgotten by time. They were shirts, shawls, and trousers, once belonging to men and women, perhaps even villagers he might have known by name. The sight of them filled his chest with a crushing weight of dread. These were not just abandoned rags. They were silent witnesses to suffering, fragments of lives that had entered this mansion but had never left. Each piece of cloth seemed to whisper stories of fear and struggle, of people who had once dared to hope but had instead met a terrible fate. The deeper Rafik stepped into the room, the heavier the smell became. It clung to the air, sharp and metallic, the undeniable scent of dried blood and decay. It froze his blood in his veins, making him feel as though he had stumbled into a tomb. He could not escape the thought that the cries he had once heard were connected to this very place, that the names in the ledger had ended here, in these chains, on this floor. His lantern shook in his hand, the light quivering across the damp stone walls, casting long shadows that twisted like grasping hands reaching out from the darkness. Rafik's breath grew shallow, and his heart raced wildly, but he forced himself to look closer. In the corner, he saw piles of broken tools and more tattered cloth, soaked into the ground as though time itself had tried to bury the truth. Every detail screamed that he was not the first to walk this path. Many before him had entered with hope, only to leave their last traces here, hidden away beneath the mansion. For the first time, Rafik fully understood the danger he was in. The food, the shelter, the double wages, all of it had been bait, a trap woven with promises to lure the desperate. And now, standing in the basement among the shackles and remnants, Rafik realized a horrifying truth. The landowner did not simply lose his workers. He consumed them. Rafik's heart almost stopped when he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, the lantern shaking in his trembling hands, and there stood the landowner. Gone was the fake smile. Gone was the friendly welcome he had shown on Rafik's first day. The mask of warmth that had fooled so many before had finally fallen away. His face was twisted now, not with kindness but with fury, his eyes burning like cold fire in the dim light. The storm outside howled, thunder cracking as if to mirror the anger in the man's expression. For the first time, Rafik saw him not as a wealthy master or a respected landowner but as something much darker, someone who thrived on secrets, fear, and blood. The silence in the room pressed down heavily as the landowner stepped closer, his shoes echoing against the stone floor. His voice, low and venomous, sliced through the air like a knife. "You weren't supposed to last this long." The words sent a shiver crawling up Rafik's spine. They were not shouted, not barked with authority, but whispered, soft, deliberate, and filled with deadly intent. The tone was worse than a scream. It carried the weight of years of cruelty, of countless lives that had ended in this very basement. It was as though he was confessing and threatening in the same breath. Rafik's mind raced. The ledger, the cries in the night, the shackles, the torn clothing, all the signs he had pieced together suddenly clicked into place. Those before him had not simply vanished. They had been destroyed, one by one, their stories ending in this house of shadows. The landowner had expected Rafik to break sooner, to surrender to fear, or perhaps to stumble into a trap long before now. But Rafik's strength, his stubbornness to keep going, had made him an unusual case. And that clearly enraged the man who stood before him. The landowner's eyes locked on him, unblinking and cold, like a predator studying prey that had strayed too far. Every step he took forward seemed calculated, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he enjoyed stretching out the fear. Rafik tried to hide his terror, but the trembling of his hands gave him away. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing wildly across the walls, making the room feel alive with dark shapes closing in. In that moment, Rafik realized the truth. This was not just about being caught snooping. This was about survival. The landowner's words made it clear. Rafik had already been marked, just like the others. The only difference was that he had lasted longer than anyone else. But now, his time had come. His fate was being sealed, not with a shout or a blow, but with a whisper that promised death. And as the landowner's rage boiled beneath his calm, twisted face, Rafik understood one thing with chilling certainty. He was standing on the razor's edge between life and becoming another completed name in the hidden ledger. Rafik's lungs burned as he sprinted down the long, twisting corridors of the mansion, the sound of heavy boots thundering close behind him. Panic surged through his veins, each heartbeat louder than the storm raging outside. His chest heaved, his breath ragged, yet he dared not slow even for a moment. Shadows stretched across the endless halls, swallowing him in darkness, while the flickering lanterns on the walls cast eerie, shifting shapes that seemed to reach out and grab at him. Behind him, the landowner's men shouted, their voices carrying the cold promise of capture and punishment. They were relentless, their footsteps growing closer with every second, echoing through the mansion like drums of doom. Rafik darted toward the first door he saw, his hand shaking as he grasped the handle, but it was locked tight. He yanked at it desperately, the wood rattling beneath his grip, but it did not budge. A surge of dread coursed through him as he stumbled back, glancing both ways down the hallway before pushing himself forward again. Another door appeared just ahead. His hope rose, only to be crushed when that one too refused to open, the lock mocking him with its stubborn silence. His desperation grew, each failed attempt tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Every corner he turned led only to more endless passageways. Every hallway looked the same, dark, tall, and suffocating, as though the mansion itself was a maze designed to trap him forever. The exits he longed for, the front doors, the windows, the gates, seemed to vanish. It was as if the walls themselves were shifting, closing in, sealing off any chance of escape. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the dust in the air, while the pounding of his footsteps blended with the storm's fury outside. Lightning flashed through narrow windows high on the walls, offering brief glimpses of the mansion's vast size, only to leave him once more in choking darkness. Behind him, the men were growing closer, their shouts sharper, their anger louder. He could almost feel their presence, like hands stretching out to grab him from the shadows. His mind screamed for him to keep moving, to not give up, though exhaustion clawed at his muscles and fear gnawed at his spirit. Each locked door he passed whispered the same cruel truth: there was no easy way out. He was caught in a trap that had been perfected over years, a design meant to ensure no worker ever left alive. As he ran, the walls seemed to tighten, the hallways stretching endlessly ahead, each corner only leading him deeper into the landowner's web. With every step, his options vanished one by one. And though he fought with every ounce of strength left in him, Rafik knew that the mansion was not just a house. It was a prison, one that was alive with secrets, with blood, and with chains, and it would not let him escape so easily. Just when Rafik thought all hope was lost, his foot slipped against a loose stone in the wall. He crashed to the ground, his hands scraping against the rough floor, and in that painful instant he noticed something strange. The stone had shifted slightly, revealing a narrow crack in the wall, so small that it almost disappeared in the shadows. His heart pounded as he pushed harder, and to his amazement, the stone gave way, revealing a hidden passage. It was an old servant's tunnel, long forgotten, concealed behind layers of dust and cobwebs. Without a second thought, Rafik dropped to his knees and squeezed himself into the narrow opening, his body scraping against the cold, damp stone as he crawled inside. The passage was suffocating, filled with stale air that smelled of earth and rot. Every movement forward was a struggle, his shoulders scraping against the tight walls, his knees dragging painfully along the rough ground. Behind him, the shouts of the landowner's men grew louder, their boots pounding against the floors of the mansion as they searched every hall and chamber. Rafik's chest tightened with fear. If they found the passage, he would be trapped with nowhere to run. Yet the thought of freedom pulled him forward, giving him strength he did not know he had. The walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness pressing like a heavy weight. His lantern had been left behind in his desperate rush, and now he could see nothing but blackness ahead. Still, he crawled, his hands feeling the damp stone, his breath echoing loud in the narrow space. At times, he thought he heard voices behind the walls, whispers carried by the wind through cracks and gaps. Was it his imagination, or the cries of those who had come before him? He shook the thought away and pressed on, refusing to stop. Minutes felt like hours. His arms ached, his knees throbbed, and the foul air clawed at his lungs. But then, at last, he felt something different. A breeze. A faint current of fresh air brushed against his face, carrying with it the scent of rain and trees. His heart leapt with hope. With renewed strength, he crawled faster, ignoring the pain in his body, until finally the passage widened into a small opening hidden behind overgrown weeds outside the mansion's walls. Rafik pushed through the tangled roots and dirt, gasping as he emerged into the stormy night. Rain poured down on him, soaking his clothes, but it felt like the sweetest blessing. For the first time since he entered the mansion, he was breathing the air of freedom. Behind him, the landowner's furious voice echoed faintly through the walls, the sound of a predator robbed of its prey. Rafik collapsed onto the wet grass, trembling with exhaustion but alive. He had barely escaped the grip of death, crawling through shadows into freedom. The mansion still loomed behind him, a dark monster watching from afar, but he was out. He had survived what so many before him could not. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the sky gray and heavy with clouds. Rafik, exhausted and trembling, went straight to the nearest police station. His words spilled out quickly, every detail of the mansion, the basement, the ledger of names, the hidden passage, and the terrible secrets he had uncovered. At first, the officers looked at him with doubt, as if his story was too dark to be real. But the fear in his eyes and the wounds on his body spoke louder than words. Within hours, a group of armed police gathered, their faces grim with determination, and they followed Rafik back to the cursed estate. The mansion stood silent when they arrived, its tall walls and shuttered windows giving away nothing of the horrors hidden inside. But the silence did not last long. Police stormed through the doors, their boots echoing through the endless halls where Rafik had once fled for his life. They kicked open locked rooms, searched every corner, and broke into the basement where the air still carried the metallic stench of death. What they found confirmed every word Rafik had spoken. Shackles lined the walls, torn clothes were scattered across the ground, and dried stains marked the stones where countless victims had suffered. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. Outside, in the fields behind the mansion, the ground was uneven, patches of earth disturbed and freshly covered. The officers began digging, and with every strike of their shovels, the truth clawed its way to the surface. One by one, bodies were unearthed, dozens of them, buried in shallow graves, their stories silenced by the landowner's cruelty. Some were nothing more than bones, others still wrapped in the rags they had once worn when they came seeking work. The air filled with a chilling silence as the officers stood over the rows of the dead, realizing the scale of the nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The landowner, once known in whispers as a wealthy recluse, was revealed for what he truly was. He had never been searching for workers, never intended to keep anyone employed. The food, the shelter, the double wages, it had all been a cruel trap, a lure for the desperate and the poor. He did not want hands to work his fields. He wanted prey to satisfy his twisted hunger for control and blood. Every victim that entered his home was never meant to leave, their fate sealed from the moment they accepted his offer. The officers placed the landowner in chains, dragging him from his mansion as villagers gathered at the gates. Gasps and cries filled the air as they realized how many of their missing loved ones lay in those fields. And as the mansion stood looming, dark and hollow, the truth was clear. It had never been a home. It was a hunting ground, and its master, the landowner, had always been a predator disguised as a man.